Lord is upon me! Faster, he outruns us! I'm like you always.
I read these ancient scrolls, clinging to the memory of two wild prophets who somehow touched the divine while our world fell completely apart. Elijah and Elisha walked through our deepest national nightmare. We had abandoned our Creator for hollow idols, yet these fierce men shattered the silence with impossible wonders, defying our corrupted kings, proving the Ancient of Days wasn't dead, but breathing among us. My heart races at the sheer terror of their story, unearthly fire, and a stubborn faith that rewrote our destiny. You and I are about to walk this terrifying path alongside these towering prophets, starting with a wild shadow emerging from the wasteland. A man who dared to challenge our rotting kingdom and drag fire down from the sky. We were drowning in absolute darkness under King Ahab. I remember the suffocating weight of it all. This was never just about political chaos or empty stomachs. The divine identity that made us entirely unique in this world was dissolving right through my trembling fingers like dry, dead sand. The magnificent kingdom united by David and crowned by Solomon was violently torn in half. And here in the bleeding north, my people had spiraled into a sick betrayal of the Creator, rotting deeper with every single generation. Then Ahab seized the crown, and instantly, he deliberately dragged us away from the God who had shattered our Egyptian chains and given us a home. 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 30 captures the terrifying, heartbreaking reality of our lost identity. It records that Ahab, son of Omri, committed far more atrocities in the Creator's sight than any ruler before his time. Knowing my people had already suffered under a string of cruel kings who mocked heaven, that truth paralyzed me. After a long, bloody parade of rulers tearing up the sacred vows our grandfathers swore, Ahab was the absolute worst. The very land that once vibrated with divine, overwhelming glory, pouring from Solomon's temple, now reeked of demonic incense. My own streets, which used to hum with holy prayers, now echoed with the dark, hypnotic chanting of foreign idols. We were meant to be a blazing beacon of spiritual truth for the entire earth, proving what real faith looked like. Instead, I watched us mimic the foulest depravities of our enemies, the sacred promise God swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob felt totally dead to me, smothered by our own toxic rebellion and willful blindness. What terrified me most about Ahab was that he did not just tolerate the darkness. He weaponized it. He personally funded the bloody altars and massive shrines to these foreign statues, hired legions of dark clerics, and built a society where just whispering the Creator's true name could get you killed. The spiritual rot devouring my soul and my nation was no accident. It wasn't mere laziness. This cultural suicide was being coldly engineered by the exact king assigned to guard our hearts and uphold the holy law. Just when I thought my shattered world could not possibly get darker, Ahab made a choice that doomed our history. He dragged a monster right into our home, a foreign royalty named Jezebel. Look at this with me. This was no standard political handshake between neighbors, the way rulers usually sealed their borders back then. It was a demonic plague that cursed my generation and the ones yet unborn. It injected pure psychological terror straight into the bleeding heart of our sacred community in ways I had never witnessed. Jezebel hailed from the wealthy shores of Sidon, a twisted place obsessed with Baal and other dark entities. When she seized our throne, she didn't just leave her ancient demons at the border. She unleashed them upon us, completely obsessed with infecting every inch of my homeland. 1 Kings 16:31 captures the exact moment our identity fractured. He treated the vile sins of Jeroboam like casual jokes. But then he actually married Jezebel, the fierce daughter of Ethbaal, lord of the Sidonians, bowing his soul completely to Baal. Jezebel was a terrifying nightmare unlike any queen we had ever faced. I watched her operate, brilliant, totally cold-blooded, crushing anyone in her way. She absolutely despised the idea of being some quiet, pretty wife fading into the palace shadows. She poured her furious energy into rewriting our very souls, completely erasing our sacred heritage. And God help me, her methods worked flawlessly. Driven by her violent vision, I watched massive, grotesque shrines to Baal sprout up in my own neighborhood and across our broken kingdom. These were not quiet little altars hiding in the alleys. They were terrifyingly beautiful structures, towering, hypnotic monuments built to seduce my friends away from genuine faith. I saw hundreds of dark priests flooding the courts, running their elaborate, twisted ceremonies. This cult fiercely tempted exhausted workers like me. When you are starving, trusting Baal to command the clouds, send rain, and force the wheat to grow, feels completely irresistible. Baal's clerics whispered beautiful, desperate lies to anyone willing to bow down. They swore that if I surrendered my soul to their temple rituals, this Baal would guarantee me perfect rain, heavily loaded barns, fat cattle, and endless wealth. In a deeply brutal world, trading my ancestral faith for a full stomach felt like simple, basic survival logic. My own friends, raised on holy miracles, chose fast results over an invisible, demanding creator who expected genuine holiness. The temptation to sell out was completely agonizing. But Jezebel didn't just stop at building grand temples and peddling earthly greed. Almost overnight, began hunting down any one of us who dared to still whisper the Almighty's name. This was absolutely no cultural shift. It was a literal slaughter. She wanted every trace of our spiritual identity erased in blood. 1 Kings chapter 18 verse 4 shows exactly how terrified I was and how close we came to total extinction. It reveals that while Jezebel butchered our holy men, Hodiah managed to smuggle 100 prophets into 2 dark, hidden caves, 50 in each, secretly keeping them alive with bread and water. It proves my own friends were being hunted down like animals simply for refusing to lose their souls. Holy voices cowering in the dirt like common criminals. What would you and I do in that absolute darkness when holding the light means losing our lives? I was living in terror, my survival resting entirely on whispered warnings and hidden bread from allies like Obadiah. Following our true God wasn't simply frowned upon anymore. It was a death sentence. I felt my faith suffocating in this pitch-black, terrifying spiritual wasteland. But in the shadows, heaven was preparing a man. Someone to shatter the darkness choking my people, to remind us our God was still on the throne. And the man chosen for this terrifying, impossible task, he was a complete nobody. A man named Elijah, crawling out of some forgotten dust bowl called Tishbe in the rocky hills of Gilead. I knew nothing of his bloodline, No rumors of his schooling, no whispers of wealthy parents. I couldn't even tell you his age when the heavens broke open for him. Was he born into silver, or did he scrape for crumbs? Did he study ancient scrolls, or did he just work the land with calloused hands like the rest of us? I never knew if he had a wife waiting, or if he was graying or young. I had no idea how he spent his days before the call came, but out of every terrified soul trembling in Israel, heaven pointed its finger at this one rugged stranger, plucked from nowhere to scream truth into the deadliest era my people ever faced. But as you and I both know, this is exactly how heaven always operates. The Almighty rarely picks the obvious hero. He takes a broken, ordinary person from a forgotten dirt road and makes them shake the foundations of the earth. He ignores the wealthy. He bypasses the scholars, the politicians, and the cultural icons. He hunts for someone who refuses to bow to fear, someone who stands firm when my courage fails, speaking fire even with a blade pressed to their throat. Carrying the mantle of a prophet wasn't just a title. It was a death wish. They were the raw, unfiltered voice of heaven, commanded to spit hard truths into the faces of monarchs and beggars. They needed enough backbone to enrage tyrants without blinking, while the rest of us hid. They had to cling to divine promises when every shadow screamed of defeat. Strong enough to stand totally alone when my people surrendered. And now the Creator was sending Elijah straight into the jaws of the most ruthless rulers walking our soil. He was marching against a fake religion I watched my neighbors embrace, a twisted lie funded and enforced by the crown itself. He had to tear down the very idols my friends loved. And he had to do it knowing the queen was watching. Jezebel had already slaughtered priests just like him. Facing her demanded a reckless, almost terrifying bravery. An ironclad faith, trusting heaven for every breath and scrap of food. When this wild man finally steps out of the shadows, it hits like a lightning strike to the soul. No polite warning, no gentle prologue to ease my terrified heart into his story. I never learned his origin or how the Spirit fell on him. I still wonder how he bypassed the palace guards. How does a filthy stranger casually stroll up to the throne? Instead, reading 1 Kings 17:1 drags you and me right into the middle of this terrifying collision. I watched Elijah the Tishbite stare down Ahab and declare, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain these next years except at my word." I stood paralyzed by his audacity. You can barely grasp the madness of that threat unless you lived under that suffocating royal shadow like I did. Ahab wasn't a mayor. He was a ruthless dictator gripping the throat of my nation. He held my fragile life and everyone else's in his manicured hands. Hidden in a fortress of gold, guarded by killers and sycophants, he draped himself in silk, feasted on my people's labor, and marched entire armies. A flick of his wrist meant I could be chained in a dungeon, bled, or beheaded. Crashing into this fortress of ego walks a ghost from a dirt village my neighbors couldn't even point to on a map. He doesn't beg. He doesn't grovel for the floor or excuse his interruption. I expected him to kneel, to flatter the tyrant like every other broken citizen. He refuses to coat his words in honey. Instead, he boldly strides within striking distance of the monster holding our leashes, and spits out a curse that would starve me, my family, and all of Israel. His opening words hit me like a physical blow. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve." In that split second, I realized he wasn't pushing a political agenda or venting about the cultural decay. He wasn't giving Ahab a polite warning born from human intellect. My soul shook as he unleashed an authority I'd thought was extinct. This man was channeling raw, unfiltered wrath straight from the true king's mouth. Hearing the God of Israel made my blood run cold. He was drawing a line in the sand. He wasn't invoking Baal, the sickening idol Jezebel forced down our throats. He rejected the cheap statues my neighbors surrendered to. He called upon the ancient, forgotten God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The same invisible force that dragged my ancestors from Egyptian chains, gifted us this soil, and carved his covenant into the stone at Mount Sinai. The dark verdict he hurled at Ahab was a death warrant for everything I knew, sealing our nation by declaring no dew or rain for years until he gave the signal. I knew instantly this wasn't just a brief inconvenience or some minor shift in the seasons. He was summoning a brutal, suffocating drought that would drag on endlessly, crushing my reality and breaking everyone around me, from the fat aristocrats down to starving peasants like me. In my ancient world, tied strictly to the dirt and the herds we raised, water wasn't merely a blessing. It was our heartbeat. My survival relied on pulling grain from the earth, and those crops only sprouted if heaven wept at the exact right moment. Without rain, my fields would turn to ash, and the herds would starve. The brutal drought outside was finally matching the dry, spiritual famine inside my soul. You watch the wells turn to dust, leaving your people desperate for a single drop. In this brutal Middle Eastern climate, timing is everything. You know your people rely on specific seasons of rain just to plant their fragile crops. They need exact moisture for the seeds to grow, yet live in constant dread that a sudden downpour could completely destroy a harvest ready for gathering. For generations, your fellow Israelites memorized the skies, anchoring their entire survival and daily lives around these familiar, comforting weather cycles. With one breath, your prophecy shatters that illusion of safety. But you know this coming drought is far more than an ecological disaster or bad weather. You have declared a terrifying spiritual war. It is the God of Israel against Baal. The seductive false idol Queen Jezebel has tempted your people into worshiping. Baal's followers scream arrogant claims about his ancient power. They insist this dark deity is the true master who commands the chaotic storms, who dictates exactly where the rain falls, and who alone decides whether you will ultimately starve or survive. These pagan priests design dark, complex rituals, bleeding themselves in frantic ceremonies. They believe this will manipulate their God into sending the vital weather your families desperately need. They promise that if you just surrender your faith, make the dark offerings, and follow their exact procedures, Baal will reward you with perfect skies and heavy harvests. And honestly, the temptation to believe them is overwhelming, because it offers the one thing humanity craves: control over the terrifying chaos of life. But now, you must stand and declare that the true God of Israel is about to violently expose exactly who commands the skies. Your brutal drought will prove this false idol is absolutely, utterly powerless. And every drop of blood spilled for him is entirely worthless. No matter how frantic the rituals become, or how many desperate sacrifices burn on their altars, no matter how loudly they scream into the void, the skies will stay like iron, and the earth like dust. Your chilling phrase, "Accept at my word," carries terrifying weight. It means that when the rains finally return, no one will ever mistake it for Baal waking up to save his worshippers. Instead, the breaking of the curse will only happen when Yahweh decides, speaking entirely through you, his isolated and fearful prophet. You are forcing them to see not just a God who punishes with barren skies, but the only power capable of restoring life when the time is right. The moment those catastrophic words leave your mouth, you do not linger in Ahab's gilded halls to gauge his fury or debate the apocalyptic future you just unleashed. You refuse to stay and argue with arrogant advisors or defend your sanity against the sneering elites who mock your faith. Instead, your heart pounding, you fall back on the strange, solitary instructions the divine voice gave you right before you stepped into the fire. As 1 Kings chapter 17 records, the whisper of the Lord commanded you, "Leave this place, turn east, and vanish into the Chariots ravine, far beyond the Jordan." The timing of this absolute exile exposes a profound, terrifying grace. It shows a master architect preparing for the fallout. He knows that the second you speak that curse of drought, you instantly become the most hunted fugitive in Israel. The moment the panic sets in, as their green fields turn into cracked, barren dust, as the wells choke on sand and the economy completely collapses, a terrified King Ahab will unleash every soldier he has to hunt down the man who broke their world. The tyrant assumes that if he can just chain you up, he can torture you into reversing the spell, forcing the skies open to save his collapsing empire. The wilderness chosen for your exile is the ultimate void, a flawless psychological refuge for a man who must cease to exist. The Chariots ravine cuts deeply east of the Jordan River, pushing you far beyond the borders of Ahab's power. Miles past the reach of the soldiers hunting you down, you find yourself entirely alone in a remote, jagged mountain wasteland where the silence is deafening. Here, a desperate soul could bury their identity for years without a single human contact. The jagged trench becomes your only sanctuary from the elements and the assassins tracking you. Towering stone walls shield your tired body from the scorching sun and biting winds, swallowing your shadow so no distant scout could ever spot you. At your feet, a tiny, fragile brook offers a steady pulse of fresh, clear water, a miracle that becomes pure gold as the rest of your nation slowly chokes on the spreading drought. Being pushed into this specific, terrifying isolation proves that heaven had mapped out your entire psychological survival long before the crisis hit. You aren't just fleeing in blind panic. This isn't some chaotic, last-second scramble for survival. Instead, it is a deliberate, agonizing spiritual quarantine meant to protect your soul during the dark years ahead, placing you precisely at the center of a larger mystery. Being buried alive in this rocky tomb forces you to realize that heaven's agenda is about far more than just hiding you from assassins. In the suffocating quiet, you are stripped of your public identity entirely. You are unable to feed on the applause or the hatred of the crowds. Out here, completely exiled from society, you are forced to face the raw, naked reality of your own faith, waiting in the deafening silence for the next terrifying command. Yet what happens beside that fading stream is one of the most deeply unsettling, psychologically bizarre miracles in all of ancient history. The divine voice swore to keep you breathing while you wasted away in this rocky prison. But the lifeline sent to you is so dark, so violently opposed to the natural laws of your world, that your human mind could never have anticipated the terror of it. In 1 Kings chapter 17, God seals your fate with one jarring promise. You will drink the wild water, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you. To grasp the absolute horror and beauty of this, you must realize what these scavengers truly represent in the wild. You and I know ravens aren't tame animals trained to serve human beings. They are entirely wild. Aggressive, flesh-eating scavengers. They are completely selfish, looking out only for their own survival. In my ancient, dusty world, we saw these dark birds as omens of death, ruin, and isolation. These were the exact creatures that swarmed battlefields to feast on the broken bodies of fallen men. They brought the smell of rot and ruin, never comfort or care. The thought that these exact dark birds would faithfully and regularly drop meat to a man like me was completely impossible on a normal day. But the Almighty gave these dark birds a clear divine command, and they obeyed him with terrifying perfection. The text of 1 Kings 17:6 records exactly what I lived. They brought me bread and flesh in the morning, and again as the sun set. I drank from the muddy brook. Every single day, twice a day. Without missing a beat, these wild creatures dropped into my ravine, carrying exactly what I needed to survive the isolation. They didn't bring me rotting scraps or moldy crumbs pulled from some forgotten garbage pile. It was good, rich, life-saving food. Bread and meat fit for any man sitting at a proper table. The bread felt like the heavy flatbread we ate all over our region, while the thick cuts of meat gave me the heavy strength I desperately needed to fight off the crushing loneliness. This impossible meal continued day after day, week after long week, bleeding into months, eventually adding up to endless years. Those dark wings never missed a single drop. They never dropped spoiled or weak portions. They never abandoned me when the shadows grew long. It was a terrifying display of his total power over nature and his solid, unshakable care for a broken man hiding in the dirt. But sitting there chewing that bread, it forced me to face a few deep truths every morning. First, it proved that the very same maker who pushed me to declare a deadly drought could easily keep me breathing, even when survival felt completely impossible. If he could force wild scavengers to break their own greedy nature just to keep my lungs pumping, then he absolutely had the authority to lock up the clouds and control the sky on his perfect schedule. Second, watching those birds descend reminded me that his rescue was unnatural, yet entirely reliable. Even while my mind slipped and my entire nation crumbled under the weight of the drought, even while my own people screamed for a drop of water, his grip on my fragile life never slipped. That steady rhythm kept me sane, giving me the courage I needed to face the nightmares still waiting for me. But while I sat quietly out of sight in the Kerith ravine, chewing on dark miracles twice a day and drinking cold water from my shrinking stream, the rest of my beloved Israel was starting to feel the horrific, suffocating choke of the drought I had spoken into existence. You and I know how human denial works. When those early rains skipped their normal season, my neighbors probably brushed it off. We told ourselves that the skies were just late, that seasons shift, and brief dry spells hit our dusty hills all the time. But as the slow weeks bled into agonizing months, and those months dragged toward a full year, the silent panic set in. Something heavy and devastating was choking us. The autumn downpours just never arrived. The heavens stayed brutally blue, week after empty week. The sun hammered down on soil that should have been bursting with green wheat, baking it into cracked, dead dirt instead. Deep family wells we had trusted for generations turned to dust. Cold springs our grandfathers swore by gave up a final muddy drop, then choked completely. I heard how our sheep collapsed as the grass vanished and the riverbeds cracked. The cost of grain skyrocketed into madness when our people realized the harvest was entirely dead. What had started out as a dry spell was turning into a waking nightmare. Up in his palace, King Ahab realized this horror was locked directly to the very words I had spoken right to his face in that throne room. This was no random climate shift, and no earthly logic could explain away the empty sky. This was the terrifying weight of my prophecy coming true, and to Ahab, finding me meant finding the only key that could stop his empire from turning to ash. I felt the heat as he launched the most violent, obsessive manhunt our nation had ever seen. He didn't just send a few palace guards on horseback. It was a frantic, bloodthirsty purge, dragging in the military, palace officials, spies, and foreign kings. The king burned through his treasury and traded dark favors with bordering nations, desperate to drag me out of the shadows. My voice held the only water left on earth. The sheer terror of this hunt hit me later, when Obadiah confessed to me in 1 Kings 18:10, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you." Hearing that chilled my blood. Ahab had turned my face into an international obsession, leveraging political threats and twisting the arms of foreign kings. His paranoid, spiraling obsession to capture me in the dark reveals exactly how broken his mind had become, and what he truly feared was choking his empire. First off, it proves that even a corrupt, arrogant dictator knew this dead earth was a spiritual punishment, not a farming crisis. If he honestly thought this was just a bad season for the crops, he never would have drained his army and treasury hunting down one lonely man. Second, his vicious hunt showed his delusion that he could break my mind, forcing me to end the famine with a blade to my throat. He figured if he just locked me in chains, he could torture me into commanding my God to open the heavens. You and I both know what this really meant. The king was absolutely terrified of what lived inside me. The king stubbornly refused to acknowledge the God who had given me this spiritual authority. But the sky stayed like iron, month after month, year after agonizing year. No rain, no relief. Their hunt for me grew increasingly ruthless and utterly desperate. Kingdom crops withered into dust. Herds of livestock collapsed in the fields. Real starvation crept into homes as food vanished, and the cost to survive outpaced what any ordinary family possessed. The pagan priests of Baal performed every frantic ritual and blood sacrifice imaginable, begging their idol to crack open the heavens. But the pagan altars stayed dry. Their false god remained totally silent and paralyzed, abandoning his desperate followers when they needed him most. And where was I? The prophet who called down this ancient curse? I was hiding under divine protection, kept alive day after day by a profound miracle. It proved the Creator's fierce loyalty to those willing to trust him. The psychological contrast felt absolutely staggering to me. While a whole nation starved and a wicked king hunted me down, I sat in strange, isolated peace. I was fed by the very divine authority that locked the sky tight, a power that would, in its own perfect season, finally break the drought. I spent months hiding beside the brook Chariots, an outcast fed by black ravens, drinking from a slowly fading stream. But then my sanctuary fractured. The famine I had spoken into existence was so devastating, so completely relentless, that my only source of water turned into cracking mud. The ancient text of 1 Kings chapter 17 reveals the painful truth. The brook dried out completely. Not a single drop of rain remained. Watching that water vanish wasn't just terrifying for me. It was a divine signal. My time in isolation was over. A new spiritual trial was beginning. The Creator handed me new orders that felt terrifying, almost suicidal. As 1 Kings chapter 17 records, the word of the Lord came directly to me in the silence. He said, "Go right now to Zarephath and Sidon. Settle down there. I have commanded a local widow in that city to feed you." Zarephath was in Sidon. That was the evil Queen Jezebel's backyard, the absolute beating heart of Baal worship. I was a marked man, heavily hunted by the royal army. Walking into that pagan stronghold was a death sentence. But you and I both know the divine path often leads straight into the dark shadows we fear most. Sometimes we are pushed to the absolute edge of survival just to witness a miracle. Exhausted, I finally dragged myself to the heavy stone gates of Zarephath. I spotted a frail woman picking up broken branches. Deep in my spirit, I knew instantly. This was her, my unlikely savior. What happened next laid bare the horrifying psychological toll of the famine. When I asked her for a simple cup of water and a crust of bread, her broken voice revealed a soul standing on the edge of death. The ancient script of 1 Kings captures her crushing despair. She swore, "As surely as your God breathes, I have no baked bread left, just a tiny scraping of flour in a jar and a few drops of oil. I am collecting these twigs to cook one final meal for me and my little boy. Then we will eat it, and we will starve to death." She was completely broken, physically and mentally spent. She was staring into the abyss, resigning her identity as a mother to become a victim of a cruel, slow end. Knowing this, my next command felt almost violently selfish. I looked at this starving widow and told her to bake me a little loaf of bread first, before feeding her own dying child. But I anchored that heavy demand to a massive divine promise. I told her, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, declares. That jar of flour will never empty out, and that jug of oil will never run dry until the day heaven finally pours rain on the earth." The text of 1 Kings chapter 17 records this. I was asking her to risk everything on a sheer psychological leap of faith. Handing her last bite of food to an exiled stranger, trusting some foreign deity to save her flesh and blood. Yet somehow the spiritual weight of my voice pierced her fear. Against all human logic, she chose to step into the unknown. The ancient record of 1 Kings shows the supernatural outcome. She turned around and obeyed my voice. Because she did, there was sudden daily nourishment for me, for her, and for her boy. The scraping of flour miraculously restored itself. The hollow jug kept pouring thick oil, honoring the exact promise the Creator had spoken through my dry lips. That quiet, intimate miracle repeated every single morning for months. Whenever her tired hands scraped the clay jar, she found exactly enough flour to survive. Every tilt of the jug gave just enough oil to bake. We were never rich, the food never piled up, but the fear of starvation was silenced, one single day at a time. It became a living map of spiritual reliance. You and I crave total security, but faith often means trusting the unseen to give us just enough for today. That mysterious, steady flow of sustenance went on for seasons. It built a hidden fortress of peace in my exile, where I could pray safely in the shadows, invisible to Ahab's ruthless army. The widow and her boy had escaped the cold grip of famine. They were slowly learning to lean on this foreign god who fed them in secret. But then, a sudden darkness crashed into our sanctuary, shattering my faith and hers in a way hunger never could. The little boy fell violently sick. This was no passing fever or common childhood cold. It was a brutal, relentless disease. He faded fast, no matter how desperately she wiped his brow. We were isolated in an ancient world where medicine was just superstition and hope. Sickness like this almost always ended in the grave, especially when a child's bones were already fragile from months of punishing drought. I watched him slip further away until the absolute worst occurred. 1 Kings chapter 17 is painfully blunt. His breathing slowed down, and then he was gone. The very same child whose life was saved by a daily supernatural miracle. The boy who sat at my table eating heaven's bread. He had suffocated to death, despite the protective divine bubble that supposedly wrapped around our fragile little shelter. Her raw psychological torment ripped through the room. 1 Kings chapter 17 records the absolute agony she hurled at me as she held his lifeless body. She screamed, "What do you want with me, man of God? Did you come here just to expose my hidden sins and murder my boy?" In her blind grief, she genuinely believed my holy presence acted like a mirror, drawing a terrifying divine judgment down onto her roof. Like many of us, she thought her past guilt had finally returned to destroy her. Living near the sacred made her feel hopelessly flawed and condemned. But my response to this shattering tragedy reveals a totally different map of grace. You and I see something beautiful about the prophet's bond with the divine here. He offered no cheap philosophy to explain our suffering, about why terrible things happen when God supposedly watches over us. Instead, Elijah acted. I watched him carry the lifeless boy into his upper room. Then he did something unheard of in all our ancient scrolls. He begged the Almighty to drag a dead child back from the grave. 1 Kings chapter 17 records his agonizing cry. "Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy on the very widow hiding me?" Then he stretched over the boy 3 times, shouting into the silence, "Lord, let this boy's life return." This was no calm, collected prayer from a man who knew exactly what heaven planned to do. It was the bleeding heart of an exile struggling with divine mystery, yet fiercely believing God commanded death itself. And then the impossible happened. The ancient text tells us the Creator actually listened. Breath filled the boy's lungs. He opened his eyes. He lived. The very first resurrection in our sacred history. A terrifying, beautiful proof that God holds dominion over the grave. The ultimate shadow haunting us all. Death surrendered to a broken prophet's prayer. When Elijah handed the breathing child back to the widow, I felt her shattered faith finally heal. She whispered in 1 Kings 17, "Now I know you are a man of God. Your words are the absolute truth." That breath of life proved to us all that Elijah carried the true divine spark, and that the God of our ancestors ruled over life itself. Then came the endless dust. After 3.5 years of brutal drought, heaven ordered Elijah out of the shadows. He had to face King Ahab. The famine was slowly killing us. Even the royal palace was terrified, desperate for water. 1 Kings chapter 18 reveals Ahab and Obadiah scouring the cracked earth themselves, hunting for withered grass just to keep their horses alive. Searching through that wasteland, Obadiah suddenly found Elijah. The prophet gave him a terrifying message to deliver. Tell your master Elijah is here. 1 Kings 18. When Ahab finally stared down the ghost he had hunted for years, my king's voice shook with rage and hidden fear. "Is that you, you troublemaker of Israel?" He spat in 1 Kings chapter 18. The prophet did not flinch. "I haven't ruined our people," he shot back. "You and your father's corrupt bloodline have done that. You abandoned the eternal commands. You bowed to false idols." Then Elijah demanded a showdown, a brutal public trial to prove once and for all whose God ruled the sky. He ordered all of us to Mount Carmel. We marched there, surrounded by 450 prophets of Baal and Queen Jezebel's 400 priests of Asherah. Mount Carmel was the ultimate stage for our spiritual war, a massive peak where thousands of us could gather. It was Baal's own sacred ground, the supposed master of storms and rain. If this false god had any real power over our drought, this is exactly where he should have summoned the thunder. When my exhausted people finally gathered, Elijah's words pierced my soul. 1 Kings chapter 18 captures his legendary challenge. How long will you limp back and forth between two choices? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him. We stood in dead silence. We knew we had been desperately trying to serve two masters. Now we knew that was impossible. Elijah proposed a terrifying test. 2 bulls for the altars. 1 for Baal's priests, 1 for him. Both sides would beg their deity to hurl fire from the sky and consume the offering. The one who answers with fire is the true God. I murmured in agreement with the crowd. It was a flawless, deadly test. Baal's prophets stepped up first. What I witnessed next was a tragic, desperate display of how deeply our idolatry had blinded us. All morning they screamed to Baal. They danced frantically around the stone altar, repeating their dark rituals. But the sky stayed empty. Elijah started laughing at them. "Maybe your God is asleep," he taunted, "or traveling." The priests went completely insane. They shrieked and carved their own flesh with spears, their blood soaking the dry earth, exactly as the ancient text describes. But despite the gore, their manic devotion brought nothing. The idol remained a dead piece of stone. No lightning fell. No phantom voice answered their cries. The dead bull just sat there. Watching them bleed for hours, it hit me. This God we feared didn't exist. He was a complete illusion. When his turn came, I watched Elijah repair the Lord's broken altar, gathering the very stones we had abandoned. Jezebel had smashed those holy places during her reign of terror. He lifted 12 heavy stones, 1 for each of our forgotten tribes, reclaiming our identity. He dug a deep trench around the rocks. He stacked the wood, prepared the sacrifice, and laid it out exactly like the bleeding priests had done before him. But then he did something utterly insane. He commanded us to pour 4 massive jars of water straight over the wood and the offering. We did it 3 times. The whole altar was drenched, water cascading down the rocks and pooling into the muddy dirt trench. The scriptures say the water overflowed everywhere. You and I know how precious a single drop was to us during that suffocating drought. Pouring it into the dirt was a profound risk. It proved Elijah had zero doubt his God would show up. It also pushed the miracle past human logic. Dripping wet timber simply refuses to burn, and a totally flooded sacrifice could never ignite in the natural world. With the trap fully set, I watched the prophet step up. He whispered a profound, quiet prayer, a chilling contrast to the bloody madness of Baal. Heaven was about to listen. I stood trembling as Elijah spoke. Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God, and I serve your word. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so my lost, terrified people will finally wake up and know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning our wayward hearts back. The response was absolute. I stood frozen as heaven ripped open. The terrifying fire of the Lord fell, instantly incinerating the sacrifice, the dense wood, the very stones, and the soil beneath. It even scorched the water from the trench. This was no ordinary spark building into a flame. I witnessed a terrifying, ancient power crashing down from the sky above. It struck with a violence that swallowed the offering, the wood, and the altar stones. Even the dust beneath my feet and the pooled water vanished in a blinding flash. The fear broke me instantly. Seeing this raw, divine force, my knees gave out. I collapsed in the dirt, screaming, "The Lord! He is God! The Lord, He is God!" My doubts shattered completely in the dirt. We knew what we saw. The God of our ancestors had proved His terrifying reality. The sheer, undeniable weight of His presence crushed my rebellion. That fire answered the question of my divided identity forever. Stick with me here because you know the feeling. The true spiritual war was far from over. The false priests of Baal, the men who had manipulated my fears and corrupted my faith for years, still stood among us, dangerous and breathing. Ancient law given to Moses demanded death for those who tore our souls from the Creator. Elijah's voice pierced the tense, trembling silence of the crowd. "Seize the prophets of Baal! Do not let a single one escape." Still shaking from the holy fire, my rage awoke. We had been lied to. We grabbed all 450 false prophets. We marched them to the Kishon Valley. There, by the water, the deceivers met their violent end. It feels brutal, a terrifying bloodshed. But this purge was the only way to wash the deep spiritual poison from my fractured mind. These priests hadn't just twisted our beliefs. They built a dark, corrupt empire that hunted, silenced, and slaughtered the righteous voices I should have fiercely protected. They fueled the vile rituals that cursed our land, bringing down 3.5 years of agonizing drought and endless starvation upon us. Their violent end proved that betraying the divine carries a heavy, fatal cost. Simply exposing Baal as an empty idol wasn't enough to heal us. The architects of our deception had to be eradicated. Only then could my shattered identity heal and our dark spiritual exile finally end. The slaughter echoed across the kingdom, carrying a stark warning. My days of living in the shadows, torn between two masters, were finally dead. We had stared into the blinding truth of the Almighty. Now, I felt the crushing pressure to surrender entirely, to serve Him without hesitation. Erasing those deceivers cut out the deep spiritual confusion that had been actively poisoning my mind and starving our nation for years. With the idols shattered and my broken faith publicly restored, we waited in silence. It was time for the ultimate display of holy power, the end of a 3.5-year curse. I heard Elijah tell the king, "Go eat and drink. I hear the roar of a heavy rain." I looked at the sky, bleak, brass, and empty. Yet Elijah stood absolutely certain that the heavens were about to break open and save us. As the king went to feast, I watched the prophet climb back up Carmel to pray. This was no fleeting whisper. It was an agonizing, desperate time of pleading. I watched him crouch near the rocky summit, bowing his whole body low to the unforgiving ground, and buried his face between his knees. A stance of absolute surrender. Despite the fiery triumph we just survived, he knew he was nothing without the Maker's mercy. He knew he didn't control the storm. 7 times I watched him send his servant to scan the horizon, desperate for any glimpse of incoming rain. 6 agonizing times the boy came back with nothing. Just a barren horizon mocking my thirst. But on the 7th run, his eyes were wide with hope. A cloud, no bigger than a man's fist, is rising from the sea. That speck of vapor was the Almighty finally answering our lonely cries. Elijah immediately yelled to the king, "Harness your chariot! Run before the storm completely traps you!" What followed terrified me. But you and I know this truth. The divine can shift reality the second he acts. The transformation was absolute. Instantly, the sky bruised black, the wind howled, and a deafening heavy rain crashed down on my burning skin, while Ahab spurred his horses toward Jezreel. 3 years of cracked earth and silent prayers ended in a single breath. This was no gentle mist or passing shower. It was a violent, unyielding deluge, washing away years of barren grief. The Maker who starved us to break our pride was now pouring out mercy to heal our forgotten souls. But the psychological shock of that day wasn't over. Another terrifying display of power seized the prophet. While King Ahab fled toward his winter palace in Jezreel, whipping his horses to beat the rising mud, I witnessed something utterly impossible. The raw spirit of the Almighty crashed into Elijah. He bound his heavy cloak around his waist and sprinted ahead of the king's galloping horses all the way to Jezreel. No mortal strength could outpace a war chariot in a raging storm. That was a brutal 17 miles through the mud. Yet Elijah didn't just match those galloping royal steeds. He led them through the storm. I realized this wasn't just a physical miracle. It was God's furious energy propelling a man who had finally surrendered everything. Watching him run, it hit me. This was a spiritual map for all of us. Outrunning the crown, Elijah was forging a new path, guiding my people out of exile and back to our Maker. The terrifying fire on Mount Carmel had saved my soul, and now this wild sprint was tearing through the darkness. He honored our broken king, yet guided us home. Tell me, what false idols hold you captive today? Ahab was dragging our people into spiritual darkness. I could have used that moment to publicly crush the king, feeding my own pride to prove my holy authority. Instead, I became a runner, sprinting ahead of his chariot through the mud, honoring the crown without sacrificing my calling as a prophet of the Most High. That impossible, breathless sprint gave Ahab and every single soul watching in the pouring rain final proof. The roaring fire from the sky wasn't a trick. It was the living God at work. If anyone still questioned my identity or doubted the raw power of heaven we had all just witnessed, that supernatural run erased every single doubt. But then the king returned to his palace in Jezreel, whispering to Queen Jezebel about the blood soaked on Mount Carmel. He told her how I challenged the cult of Baal, how the sky burned, how her false priests died. He told her the rain had finally returned. You might think she would bow to this obvious miracle, broken by the total collapse of her dark religious empire. She didn't bow. She erupted into absolute rage, demanding my blood. Ancient scripture records the exact death threat she sent me. May the gods punish me without mercy if, by this exact time tomorrow, I haven't turned your miserable life into a corpse, just like my slaughtered priests. She meant the cult leaders I had just executed. This wasn't a bluff. The most dangerous, terrifyingly powerful woman in the entire land wanted me dead. A queen who had already slaughtered holy men before me. She had the soldiers and the crown to make it happen. You and I need to look closely at what this terror did to my mind. I was the man who had just stood fearless against an earthly king. I had openly mocked 450 false teachers while a nation watched. I had literally called down flames from the sky, surviving the most overwhelming biblical display of holy power in centuries. Yet the moment her deadly message arrived, Scripture says my courage vanished. I panicked. I ran for my life. It proves that even the most devoted believers, walking with God, are just fragile humans, wrestling with crippling fear and physical limits. The sheer spiritual trauma of that mountaintop showdown, mixed with the total bodily exhaustion of sprinting to Jezreel, left my mind completely broken and dangerously vulnerable. That sudden promise of murder, arriving right after my greatest spiritual victory, sent me spiraling into a total crisis of faith and identity. I fled south toward Beersheba in Judah, desperate to cross the border out of her reach. But even when I hit safe ground, I couldn't stop running. I abandoned my servant there and vanished alone into the scorching desert wilderness, dragging with me a suffocating weight of failure and deep psychological despair that had forced me to run. I had just lived through the most massive, world-shifting triumph in biblical history, yet I was plunging straight into the blackest night of my own soul, wandering into that harsh wasteland. Fleeing the trauma of her threats broke my body and mind completely. I walked a full 24 hours deep into the dry sands beyond Beersheba. Finally, my legs gave out under a lonely broom tree. I collapsed in the dirt. I prayed a desperate prayer exposing my shattered soul. The text records my literal agony. I told God I was done. I begged him to kill me, feeling totally worthless. This wasn't just a tired body talking. This was the raw sobbing of someone whose belief was entirely shattered. Even after staring right at the most stunning miracle in our timeline, I felt like an absolute pathetic failure. The altar fire meant nothing now. Jezebel still ruled the throne, the darkness still held the nation, and she was hunting me. I felt entirely alone, crushed, completely certain my calling was a wasted joke. Let's watch how God answers this despair together. He was so tender. Instead of yelling at my weak faith or pointing back to the holy fire, had just survived. The Creator sent a quiet angel to feed my starving body. A hand shook my shoulder gently. "Wake up and eat," the messenger whispered. I opened my eyes. Warm bread baking on hot stones. A fresh jar of water out of nowhere. I ate, drank heavily, and passed right back out in the dust. But the Spirit woke me again with the exact same softness. Eat something. The road ahead of you is going to break you otherwise. That second meal wasn't just to stop my stomach growling. It was divine armor for the brutal, lonely march waiting for me. Heaven knew I needed my physical and spiritual bones reset before I could hear my next mission. Fueled by that strange holy bread, I hiked 40 days and 40 nights until I hit Mount Horeb. You might know it as Sinai, the ancient, smoking peak where Moses held the stone tablets centuries before my time. My feet didn't drag me there by accident. This was ground zero, the place where the Almighty forged his eternal blood pact with us. The stage for the most massive collisions between heaven and humanity. When I finally dragged myself onto that sacred rock, I crawled into a pitch-black cave to hide, shivering through the night. Right there in the dark, the Creator's voice hit me with a question that sliced straight through my depression. The silence broke. "What are you doing in this cave, Elijah?" He wasn't asking for my coordinates. He knew exactly why I ran. He was begging his broken prophet to finally bleed out the toxic fear and anger. My answer spilled out, exposing just how deeply the exile and loneliness had infected my mind. I screamed my bitter truth into the void. "I have fought so hard for you, but our people ripped up your promises, smashed your holy altars, and murdered every last one of your messengers with the sword. I am the absolute last man standing, and now they are hunting me down like an animal." All that fire on the mountain, and I still felt like nothing mattered. I was drowning in isolation. But that cold, terrifying cave became the very place the Almighty would rewire my reality and teach me how his silent, mysterious power actually moves the modern world. This wasn't just my panicked, desperate bunker to escape a royal execution order. You and I have been here. It was the dark room where I learned truths that shatter fear and redefine what faith actually means today. God didn't just answer my desperate complaints in the dark. He gave me, and perhaps you too, a profound, terrifying vision of how unseen powers actually shape our human reality. The Creator commanded me to step outside my lonely cave and stand on the jagged peak. He was about to pass by. What happened next completely shattered everything I thought I knew about the divine nature. First, a violent, screaming wind ripped the ancient mountains apart right before my eyes, shattering solid rock into dust. But the sacred text is clear. The Creator was not in that deafening storm. This violent display was not how the Infinite chose to meet my broken, exhausted soul. Right after the howling wind died down, a massive earthquake violently shook the very foundations beneath my feet. Yet again, the divine presence was entirely missing from the tremors. Then came fire, blazing like the terrible flames I had called down back on Mount Carmel. But the Maker was not in the inferno. After surviving all this terrifying cosmic chaos, something entirely unexpected shifted the atmosphere. Ancient history records it simply: a fragile, gentle whisper, a still, impossibly quiet, small voice. No thunderous shouts, no grand, terrifying declarations. It was a faint, intimate frequency that demanded total silence and my absolute, undivided attention to catch. The second that piercing silence hit my ears, my soul recognized the absolute truth. I wrapped my heavy cloak tight over my face and stepped out to the dark mouth of the cave, trembling in total awe of the sacred. That terrifying night taught my soul that the infinite rarely operates through spectacular, flashy bursts of raw power. Sometimes, the deepest psychological transformations happen in the dark, so quietly that anyone distracted by the noise of the world will completely miss them. That consuming heavenly fire was needed to shock a sleeping, corrupted nation. But this fragile, gentle sound right here on the mountain was how eternity chose to meet me in my crushing spiritual crisis and deep identity loss. Out of the profound stillness, the question echoed again. What are you doing here? A timeless inquiry. I choked out the exact same desperate excuse, pouring out my intense shame, my failure, my crushing loneliness. But the divine silence was finished listening to my fear. I was handed a new, radical purpose that proved my lonely exile was an illusion. My new ancient orders were painfully specific and world-altering. The heavy command echoed in my bones. Turn around, face your deepest fears, walk straight back through the scorching wilderness of Damascus. And then, anoint Hazael as the king over Aram. Anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And finally, anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel-Mah, to replace you. The terrifying weight of these instructions meant sparking massive political and spiritual revolutions, reshaping my corrupt homeland and every surrounding empire. The shocking reality that I was trusted with 3 world-breaking tasks proved my story wasn't over. My overwhelming depression and fear hadn't disqualified me at all. I was actively being drafted into a massive, multi-generational master plan. A grand design to drag harsh justice into the deep, rotting political systems poisoning both my nation and the wider ancient world. Pouring that sacred oil would trigger an unstoppable chain reaction, finally finishing the bloody, terrifying spiritual war I had accidentally sparked back on that fiery mountain. But before I left, the Creator completely shattered my pathetic martyr complex. The voice pierced my thick armor of loneliness, declaring, I have kept exactly 7,000 souls alive in Israel. 7,000 whose knees never bent to the idol Baal, whose lips refused to kiss him. You and I both know the dark trap of feeling uniquely broken and completely alone. I genuinely believed I was the last standing believer. But the divine truth exposed 7,000 hidden rebels who survived the cultural pressure. That heavy revelation hit my chest like lightning. I was never actually isolated in my desperate faith. My entire life's work wasn't some cosmic failure after all. My terrifying public stand had secretly forged thousands of quiet, resilient believers hiding in the shadows of my corrupt society. Even when my eyes saw nothing but enemies and shadows, the sacred, hidden transformation of the human soul was spreading far deeper than my own fragile, paranoid mind could comprehend. The first 2 targets on my divine hit list were ruthless political giants, men destined to serve as brutal instruments in executing strict, horrifying judgment across the deeply infected structures of my homeland. Pouring that oil meant acting as the living catalyst for the ultimate master plan to purge the toxic psychological rot Ahab and Jezebel had normalized. My first terrifying assignment was crowning Hazael, pushing him onto the throne of Aram, or ancient Syria. This wasn't some minor tribe. They were the massive, looming superpower to our north, a volatile empire that flipped between trusted ally and bloodthirsty invader. Crowning Hazael meant accepting a bitter, heavy truth. The divine architect was deliberately weaponizing a pagan king to violently tear down the comfortable illusions my own stubborn people clung to. Stick with me here. Sometimes the infinite uses terrifying outside forces to discipline us, breaking our comfortable arrogance when we stubbornly refuse to change. Ancient scrolls confirm this exact political shockwave hit, even though the oil didn't drip directly from my own shaking hands in some grand public ceremony. Later texts reveal my successor Elisha finally crossed paths with Hazael, staring into his eyes to deliver the dark prophecy of his impending Syrian reign. Hazael morphed into the exact nightmare I was warned about. A brutal, towering warlord who crushed my homeland's armies for decades, acting as a cold, blunt instrument of harsh spiritual correction. My second impossible target felt even more dangerous. I had to secure the rise of Jehu, Nimshi's bloodline. He was destined to rule my very own fragmented nation. This felt vastly heavier than elevating Hazael, because anointing Jehu meant sparking a total, bloody dynastic collapse right inside our own borders. This wild commander Jugu was handpicked to absolutely annihilate Ahab's royal house, permanently crushing the psychological grip that Jezebel's false idol Baal held over my people's minds. Again, this heavy burden was carried across the finish line by my successor, Elisha. The deep historical record shows Elisha dispatched a young, terrified apprentice to pour the oil over Jehu in total secrecy, hidden away from his lethal military rivals. The moment that sacred truth leaked, Jew's hardened war generals threw their full weight behind his violent, sudden rebellion against the rotting establishment. His furious rule became the exact brutal remedy the cosmos demanded, a terrifying, agonizing era of deep psychological cleansing that finally ripped the sickness of Baal from our soil. The ancient text details exactly how Jehu systematically slaughtered those false, manipulative priests. I see the shattered temples of Baal, sacred objects turned to ash. Jezebel's blood and the entire royal family erased, the very rulers who dragged my people into spiritual exile and deep darkness. Watching these violent political shifts, I realize the divine is sovereign over every crumbling nation. God raises up rulers from the dust, simply to execute his hidden design, even when those kings are completely blind to his authority. Hazael and Jehu were just weapons in his hand, instruments of sudden divine judgment. They brought devastating consequences on those who fiercely fought against the Almighty, plunging us all into a terrifying spiritual darkness. Yet, the fact that the Creator handed these heavy anointing tasks to Elijah proves this calling wasn't just about flashy miracles or dramatic mountain showdowns. It held a terrifying, world-altering scope. I feel the profound weight of participating in a divine, long-term political strategy. He was setting unstoppable historical gears into motion, changes that would take decades of bloodshed and silence to fully unfold. But the final task the divine gave Elijah is the one that terrifies me most. The solemn anointing of a successor, the passing of the prophetic mantle. You and I know this wasn't just about filling a vacancy after he vanished. It was about bracing for a radical shift, a profound spiritual transition that would push this holy burden in Israel to a terrifying new level of spiritual influence. God had specifically named the exact soul chosen to carry Elijah's legacy: Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel, Meholah. This was no random gamble, no desperate guess left to an aging prophet's own weary mind. The Almighty had already pinpointed the exact soul destined to shoulder this crushing role. He gave Elijah crystal-clear instructions on where to hunt him down and what to demand. When that grizzled prophet marched into Abel Meholah, he found me hiding in plain sight, doing the painfully ordinary work of plowing a dusty field with oxen. 1 Kings 19:19 says, "The old man walked right up and threw his heavy cloak over my shoulders." That simple, sudden impact carried a terrifying, ancient weight. That rough fabric held his entire calling, his dangerous authority, his direct conduit to divine fire. By wrapping me in it, he was violently transferring that crushing burden to my soul. I was driving 12 yoke of oxen when that shadow fell over me. That single detail exposes everything you need to know about the life I was clinging to. First, it proved I belonged to a fiercely prosperous family. 12 pairs of massive beasts represented serious wealth, a massive, secure agricultural empire that defined my identity. I wasn't some starving peasant desperately begging the heavens for a way out. I was a man forced to surrender a perfectly comfortable, highly successful life to chase a terrifying whisper. Second, the fact that I was actively sweating in the dirt, personally driving that 12th team myself, proved I wasn't afraid of grueling labor. I was willing to bleed to get the harvest in. These gritty traits would soon become my only survival tools in the dark days ahead. The agonizing life of a chosen prophet meant facing relentless danger, standing alone in exile, and demanding every ounce of my physical and spiritual endurance to survive. My visceral reaction to that heavy cloak hitting my chest was profound. I immediately understood the terrifying isolation being offered, yet my trembling soul was ready to accept it. But the grief of leaving hit me hard. I begged to bid my parents farewell. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," I pleaded. "Then I will follow you." 1 Kings 19:20. It felt like a perfectly reasonable request, honoring my earthly family while grasping the absolute, life-shattering magnitude of the decision I was about to make. The old prophet's cold response chilled me to the bone. "Go back. What have I done to you?" 1 Kings 19:20. Was this a cruel psychological test of my fragile commitment? Or was he giving me total, terrifying freedom to walk away from the divine pressure without an ounce of coercion? Either way, the devastating truth was crystal clear. I had to stand alone and make my own brutal decision about surrendering to this biblical calling. What I did next sealed my spiritual fate forever. I turned back to my beloved oxen, slaughtered them in the dirt, and shattered my wooden plows to build a roaring fire for the meat. I fed that roasted flesh to my fellow laborers as a final feast. But this wasn't just waving goodbye. This was me burning every single bridge to my past. By butchering those loyal beasts and smashing my tools, I was making it physically impossible to ever return to my comfortable identity. 1 Kings 19:21 seals my fate. I walked away, trailing Elijah into the wilderness, becoming his devoted servant. But let me be clear. Becoming a servant didn't mean I was reduced to a mindless slave. It meant stepping into a grueling, sacred apprenticeship. I had to shadow the master, slowly absorbing the crushing psychological weight of this divine ministry. That bloody sacrifice of my prized oxen and the violent destruction of my plows marked the most traumatic yet defining moment in this entire ancient transition from master to haunted successor. You and I must realize this was no empty religious ritual. It was a terrifying, irreversible plunge into a completely alien reality that the Almighty was dragging me toward. By spilling the blood of my only livelihood and turning my wooden yokes to ash, I was acting out a brutal, profound spiritual truth for generations to witness. First, I proved my surrender to this agonizing divine voice was completely absolute and unconditional. There could be zero looking back, no cowardly second thoughts. I erased any safety net to catch me when the shadows of this prophetic burden finally grew heavier than my fragile mind could bear. Second, that bloody sacrifice proved I fully grasped the devastating cost of divine obedience. I wasn't some naive fool blinded by religious romance. I knew exactly what I was losing. And I knew a prophet's path is drenched in peril, deeply demanding, and intensely lonely. By striking a match to my own comfortable future, I openly embraced a path of exile and pain, simply because I knew deep in my bones it was what heaven demanded. Third, feeding my village from the ashes of my old life stood as a stark testimony to my family, my friends, and my entire community. Every single soul who chewed the meat of my ruined empire would remember the taste of my broken identity. They knew I had permanently died to myself to serve God. This raw public declaration forged an iron chain of accountability around my neck, locking me in, ensuring I couldn't cowardly retreat when the inevitable suffering began. That final feast mattered deeply because it proved to me, and maybe to you today, that answering a holy calling isn't about personal glory. It is about bleeding your own life dry to nourish a starving world. As I shattered the only life I knew, I felt the terrifying weight of becoming a servant. This total surrender would define every agonizing step of my prophetic journey. Burning my plow wasn't just faith, it was an absolute surrender to the divine. I watched my livelihood turn to ash, severing my only source of earthly survival. I threw myself into a void of total dependence. This terrifying leap of faith would echo in my soul, anchoring me through years of spiritual exile as I saw divine provision sustain the broken. And the exact timing of this blazing sacrifice meant everything. I didn't slowly phase out my farming or secure some safety net. I severed my past instantly, feeling the sharp, cold loneliness of an irreversible choice, proving that when the divine voice strikes, you don't calculate or transition slowly. You surrender immediately. You abandon all safety nets. That raw moment forged the pattern defining my entire bond with Elijah and my terrifying plunge into the prophetic mystery. I abandoned my independence entirely. I gave my soul to this master, binding myself to the divine will, no matter how much it shattered my personal identity. Following that traumatic farewell to the man I was, my brutal, intensive preparation began under Elijah's heavy, shadowing presence. This was no brief escape. It was a grinding, years-long stripping away of self, breaking me down to withstand the crushing spiritual warfare waiting in my future. Through those grueling days, my bond with Elijah grew into a silent, deep, and mutual reverence. I didn't just watch him from afar or absorb casual lessons when it felt safe. Instead, I became his shadow. I traveled the dust with him, shared his bitter isolation, and absorbed the terrifying, raw burden of prophetic work firsthand. 2 Kings chapter 3 reveals the quiet depth of this surrender, noting how I simply poured water over Elijah's calloused hands. To anyone watching, it was just the mundane routine of a servant washing away the desert dirt. But in the crucible of spiritual transformation, this lonely act stripped away my remaining prize. I had to be broken as a servant before I could lead. In those unrecorded years, I witnessed ancient, terrifying mysteries of faith the world never saw. I watched him wrestle in dark prayer, heard him channel the divine voice, and saw him face down venomous opposition. I learned how he survived crushing despair and spiritual exile, absorbing this agony through my own hands meant more than any scroll. It slowly forced me to bear the weight myself, unearthing my own dormant, frightening spiritual power. Elijah remained the undisputed master, the looming mountain before me. Yet, I was stepping into the frightening currents of my own calling, tested under his piercing, unyielding gaze. This agonizing delay was essential. It guaranteed that when the crushing mantle of prophecy finally fell on my shoulders, I would survive its psychological weight. I couldn't afford to guess the divine will while standing in the terrifying fires of national crisis. My soul was forged in the fire of Israel's most formidable prophet, absorbing his scars as my shield. Furthermore, this slow death of my old self ensured Israel wouldn't fall into a spiritual void when my master vanished. The people had already witnessed my transformation and felt the divine spark in me. This continuity anchored our volatile nation against a rising tide of political corruption and overwhelming spiritual darkness. And finally, our shared isolation forged an anchor of deep, unspoken love. As the terrifying day of his cosmic departure finally closed in on us, I braced myself for the shattering psychological blow of losing him, dreading the hollow silence he would leave. Those hidden years showed me the terrifying paradox of how the divine intersects with ordinary human suffering. I witnessed impossible miracles, felt the heavy hand of providence, watched ancient predictions ignite, and learned to separate divine truth from the madness of my own fear. This grueling spiritual map secured my fragile sanity. As the shadow of his supernatural exit grew long, we walked together toward the scattered prophetic communities hiding in the dark corners of Israel. These were desperate brotherhoods of outcasts, men battling their own demons while guarding the flickering flames of forgotten spiritual truth in an age of profound cultural amnesia. Our first heavy steps brought us to Gilgal, a place echoing with the ghosts of our ancestors. Here our ancient people first tasted the dust of freedom after crossing the Jordan River, stepping out of exile. Here Joshua raised 12 cold stones, a psychological monument to the divine force that severed the waters. Standing with the prophets there, I felt the desperate hunger to reclaim the forgotten spiritual identity of our bloodline. We moved on to Bethel, an ancient site of profound power where Abraham first cut into the earth to build an altar to the unseen, where Jacob wrestled with the visions of a terrifying ladder piercing the cosmic veil. But Bethel was bleeding. Jeroboam had poisoned it with golden idols, twisting faith into political control. Seeking out the prophets hidden there felt like drawing a line in the spiritual sand, demanding our souls back. Finally, we faced Jericho, the graveyard of giants, the very first stronghold that collapsed when our ancestors marched out of the wilderness. A gateway between chaotic wasteland and civilization. I realized this ancient call still echoes. Are you standing at your own river, terrified to cross? I stared at the prophetic schools around us. They were built to shape both local towns and passing travelers, yet today, those stone walls felt like isolating prisons. The younger prophets sensed my world was shattering. They crept up to me, eyes wide, asking, "Do you know the Lord will take your master today?" 2 Kings records my exact nightmare. The Almighty had already warned our whole community. Elijah's earthly time was ending, forcing a terrifying transition on my shoulders. Desperate to hold on to him, I always snapped the same reply. "Yes, I know. Be quiet." It wasn't bitter anger or an unwillingness to face the cold, hard facts. I knew exactly what was coming, but I chose to cling to every final second with my mentor, fighting off the crushing grief of our looming, permanent separation. Our final visits to these ancient prophetic outposts carried a deeply heavy purpose. First, my master needed to leave his final instructions. He had to strengthen the younger men who would shoulder this heavy spiritual burden after he was gone. His final blessing would harden their resolve, arming them against the dark, terrifying work ahead. Second, this grueling march paraded me before the brethren as his chosen heir. These men were meant to be my allies, my future supporters. They needed to witness this terrifying shift in power, to validate my fragile new identity before the crushing weight of leadership destroyed me. Third, the agonizing walk through those 3 ancient cities gave me my last sacred conversations with my master. Walking side by side in the quiet dust, hiding my fear, we found the time to discuss crucial spiritual secrets, finishing the final steps of my training. The fact that every single prophet knew his departure was coming meant I could not escape my destiny. The divine had prepared all of us for this trauma. These haunting final visits to the academies were a careful, deliberate march toward my terrifying new reality. As my master and I finished our tour of the prophetic schools, facing our absolute last miles together, the atmosphere shifted. Bizarre supernatural signs began manifesting everywhere, sealing the end of his earthly life. The heavens were loudly confirming my worst fears. It was a divine warning meant to brace me and the terrified onlookers for the impossible event about to strike. Moving between cities, I felt a suffocating, deeply solemn dread. The students possessed an eerie, divine intuition. They kept pulling me aside, whispering, demanding to know if I realized my guiding light was being ripped away from me that very day. Their terrifying collective awareness wasn't just idle rumors or basic human logic at play. It was much deeper. God himself was pouring this stark revelation into their minds. The suffocating, mystical tension only grew even thicker as we marched toward the deep waters of the Jordan River for our agonizing final steps. At every single stop, my master tested my breaking point. He practically begged me to stay behind in safety, but I fiercely refused to abandon him, shouting with absolute desperate panic, "As surely as God breathes and you breathe, I will never leave you." The ancient text forever remembers my stubborn fear. He didn't push me away because he doubted my loyalty, or to break my fragile spirit in the dust. Instead, he was forcing me to prove my devotion was totally flawless. The impending cosmic horror demanded absolute, blinding faith, stripping away every single ounce of human doubt. Even a single second of cowardice right then could have shattered my calling, costing me the massive spiritual inheritance God had secretly planned. Nearing the dark Jordan River, I felt the eyes of 50 men from Jericho burning into my back. They were hungry to witness this terrifying unknown. They lingered far back in the dusty shadows, watching us like ghosts. They respected the sacred terror of my personal trial, refusing to intervene, yet silently acknowledging that reality itself was about to be violently torn apart right before their eyes. The eerie, unearthly tension that had stalked me all day peaked at the river's edge, where the Almighty was preparing to unleash power so violently it would crush any doubts about my terrifying new identity. The very air around me heavily crackled with electric dread as we neared the ancient waters. This river held my ancestors' traumatic history, and now it formed the stage for the absolute most mind-bending moment of my entire existence. Those 50 staring men, the haunting divine whispers infecting our entire spiritual community, and the crushing gravity of our long walk all proved one chilling thing. My master wasn't just leaving. My people were being violently dragged into a frightening new divine era. The ominous heavy portents that had hunted me since dawn were merely preparing my frail soul for a shock wave of power. It would forge my new authority and prove God hadn't abandoned his lonely servants. The swirling chaos of his final hours proved I wasn't merely burying a father figure. This was absolutely no quiet funeral, no ordinary passing of the torch to the next terrified generation, but a violent tear between earth and heaven itself. It was a blinding rapture that would expose the fiery link between the Creator and my Master. It burned a permanent scar into my frail memory and into the deepest psyche of every future believer. When we finally hit the muddy banks of the Jordan River, I stared deeply down into the exact waves that held my people's ancient ghosts. This was the daunting threshold our ancestors breached under Joshua, fighting their way into the Promised Land, a place where the violent currents were miraculously chained back so an exiled nation could cross the dry earth. It's the exact same haunting river where Naaman would later. I stand where future baptisms will happen, feeling the crushing weight of ancient history. You and I step into this moment. 50 prophets stare at my back from a distance. My Master pulls off his cloak, that very same rough fabric he threw over my trembling shoulders years ago, dragging me away from everything familiar. This isn't just worn thread. It is the heavy, suffocating symbol of his calling, the living proof of a man who speaks for the divine. It holds decades of raw, terrifying power. Slowly, with a painful exactness that makes my heart pound against my ribs, he rolls the cloak tight and lashes the Jordan River. The chaos is instant. The ancient text of 2 Kings says the water rips left and right. My boots hit dry dirt as we cross. My entire identity feels like it is fracturing. This terrifying impossibility perfectly mirrors the forgotten miracles of the deep past. Like Moses cracking the sea, or Joshua stopping this exact river. But this torn water is not just a path for us to walk. It is a psychological map of my own approaching exile. First, those 50 men watching from the hills need to witness the same holy fire. The raw energy that drove our ancestors is still burning in my Master today. This broken river gives those lonely men the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, that power won't die when he leaves me. Second, it binds my Master's bloodline to the mighty, flawed leaders who suffered before us. As Moses split the dark waves and Joshua forced the current to choke, my mentor proves he commands the very same ancient, terrifying authority over nature. I will need that exact proof to survive the crippling doubt when I return alone, trying to repeat the impossible. And third, walking this dry riverbed marks a violent, permanent shift. I am losing my father figure forever. Just like our people escaping the wasteland into the unknown, we are walking out of his golden age. Now, the heavy, lonely silence of my own future is waiting on the opposite shore. This dry mud under my toes is the only proof I have for this terrifying transition. This is our absolute final test of belief. He had to trust the water would actually break when he violently whipped it with his ragged mantle. And I have to suppress my screaming instincts and follow him through towering walls of water. That single breathless choice cements the deep connection between us, bracing me for the devastating loss to come. We march into the trench together, flanked by crushing oceans held back by an unseen force. Every nerve in my body screams that we are standing inside a mystery practically no mortal has ever survived. We step right into the shadows of Moses, It proves the terrifying divine force of our ancestors hasn't abandoned us in this modern exile. Down here, the roaring water gives us isolation. We are completely hidden from the 50 anxious men staring from the far bank. In the eerie, unnatural quiet of the deep riverbed, we finally talk about the dread closing in and the agonizing burden of leadership I am about to carry alone. The moment we step out of the chasm onto the other side, he turns to me. He looks at me with a desperate love, knowing the brutal spiritual journey ahead. 2 Kings records his exact words. He says, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" My throat tightens. This is no polite goodbye. It is a terrifying invitation to name the one weapon I need to survive the coming darkness. My answer is terrified but absolute. I tell him, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." 2 Kings, chapter 2. Let's unpack the psychology of what I just asked. In our ancient culture, the eldest son always gets a double share of the family wealth. I am not demanding to be twice as famous or powerful as my master. I am terrified of failing him. I am begging for the legal right to be his true spiritual heir. This desperate plea exposes how utterly crushed I feel by the massive calling that lies ahead. First, it proves I clearly see the absolute nightmare of stepping into his massive shoes. I know the corruption in our land is toxic. The political rot is lethal. And the people are wandering blindly in sin, starved for a true spiritual awakening. I realize I will need an overwhelming, unearthly strength just to avoid breaking apart here. Second, it shows my complete, helpless reliance on heaven. I have zero faith in my own talents. I don't want better tools or an easier life. I just want a massive surge of that exact same holy energy that kept him alive all these years. It is the only sane priority for someone about to be crushed by the weight of a nation. Third, I am exposing my fierce, heartbroken love for the man standing beside me. By demanding his spirit, I am promising to protect and bleed for the work he started. I don't care about making a name for myself or starting some fresh, independent movement. I just want to survive on his foundation and carry the heavy burden of our forgotten ancient truth. His reply chills my blood. He looks at me and says, "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." 2 Kings, verse 10. He is admitting he cannot grant this himself. My identity is hanging by a thread. This massive shift must come from the divine mind itself. There is a terrifying catch. The impossible rule he places on me to keep my eyes open when he vanishes is not some random game. It is a brutal test of my sanity and faith. Watching him get ripped from reality means my soul has to stay painfully alert through the chaos. It demands a violent, unbroken focus, refusing to flinch even when the sky tears open. This ensures that if I somehow survive and inherit this crushing authority, it proves I have finally conquered my fear. Now, what do you and I do with this terrifying ability to? If I could witness his departure, it would prove I possessed the deep spiritual sight required to carry the terrifying weight of my coming calling. Asking for that double portion made the silence between us heavier. We both knew the next few agonizing minutes would decide far more than just how my master would finally leave this broken earth. It would determine if I had the spiritual strength to survive what was coming. The crushing stakes paralyzed me, and we both felt the eternal gravity of the approaching storm. As my master and I kept walking and whispering together in the desolate dust on the far side of the Jordan, The terrifying hour that haunted me all day finally crashed down upon us. What unfolded next was the most blinding, unprecedented display of the divine ever witnessed. An event so staggering, it fractures the minds of anyone who dares to seek its meaning today. 2 Kings chapter 2 sets the scene. As we walked the lonely road, talking to keep the fear away, suddenly an inferno of chariots and burning horses tore through the veil, violently tearing us apart. He was ripped into the heavens by a storm. This was no gentle fade into the night. It was a violent, divine abduction that shattered reality itself, leaving me completely exposed. The blazing arrival of those flaming beasts was a naked display of cosmic authority, a terrible glory that almost no mortal mind is equipped to endure. That holy fire mirrored the terrifying presence of the Almighty. The burning transport became a sacred vessel, severing him from this mortal earth without him ever tasting the grave. I knew this had only happened once before in ancient days, back when Enoch walked so closely with the Creator. Then he simply vanished, stolen by God, as Genesis chapter 5 records. Those blazing beasts pulling the inferno radiated an absolute, terrifying strength that mocked our fragile earthly power. These were not mortal creatures touched by magic. They were pure celestial horrors, forged in eternity just to tear my mentor away. Their blazing forms screamed of the alien reality bleeding into ours. My master was being dragged directly into the raw, unshielded presence of the divine. The screaming storm that swallowed him was pure, unleashed sovereignty. From the ancient texts, I knew chaos and storms mask his terrifying approach. When the Creator finally answered Job, he spoke from inside the violent gale. Ezekiel would later face that same blinding glory inside a crushing tempest. This vortex that consumed my father was no ordinary weather pattern from the desert, but an intentional, forceful strike from heaven itself. And the timing was painfully, flawlessly exact. It struck the exact second his earthly burden ended, leaving me to shoulder the impossible weight of his legacy. It happened right in front of me, the lonely witness, the only soul desperate enough to claim the haunting spiritual inheritance he promised. We stood isolated in the wasteland, hidden from the blind world, yet exposed completely to the heavens. The absolute violence of his exit proved to my shaking heart that eternity is real, and the grave holds no final claim over us. Escaping the bitter fate of almost every mortal before him, save Enoch, my master bypassed the dark earth and the rot of the tomb. Instead, he crossed instantly from the dirt into celestial light, proving the Almighty completely dominates the shadows of death. For me, staring into the blinding flames was a terrifying privilege, yet a heavy burden. It was a crushing, beautiful horror. I was absorbing a vision that the rest of humanity was entirely blind to in that moment, and my fragile ability to endure the sight dictated whether I was truly worthy of that double portion I begged for. My awakened sight that let me witness the burning beasts was the very thing qualifying me to carry the terrifying spiritual authority required for my lonely exile. This sudden rapture of my mentor was the perfect, terrifying climax to a life entirely consumed by the divine. The exact same fierce power that once summoned flames to devour the altar at Mount Carmel was now raining down to rip his loyal servant away from this corrupt and broken world. That relentless cosmic thread from his first miracle to his explosive exit proved the Almighty's brutal faithfulness to the few who dare to truly surrender. As the burning tracks faded into the sky, taking him forever, I was left entirely alone in the dust of the Jordan River. The majesty of the heavens had just split open, yet my soul was utterly crushed. I was drowning in an ocean of sudden, terrifying abandonment.
2 Kings chapter 2 captures my breaking heart. I saw it all and screamed into the void, "My father! My father! The chariots and horsemen of Israel!"
And then he was gone. I was empty. That desperate wail, "My father!" tore from a place of profound love and dependency we forged in the wilderness. I wasn't merely losing a prophet or a master. I was violently severed from the man who molded my soul, shielded me from the darkness, and equipped me for the impossible road ahead. Calling him Father meant I knew he was the spiritual anchor, our people, the singular voice of God I leaned on to survive. Screaming about the chariots and horsemen was my realization that our true invisible armor had just vanished. Kings boasted of their iron armies and mortal cavalry, but he was the solitary ghost waging war against unseen demons, pulling fire from the sky to shield a faithless nation. Shouting those words into the empty air, I knew our greatest shield was gone, leaving us defenseless against the coming night. Trembling with panic, I ripped my own garments apart, acting out the ancient, violent ritual of utter desolation and deep trauma. This was no fleeting moment of sadness. It was my physical surrender to a devastating reality. The heavy curtain had violently closed on the greatest era of awakening our wandering nation had ever seen. Yet lying there in the dust, choking on my own tears, my eyes caught something left behind, an object that would seal my fate forever. His heavy leather cloak. The exact same mantle he cast over my shivering shoulders years ago in the field. The same ancient fabric that split the raging river just moments ago. It lay in the dirt after the violent whirlwind tore Elijah away. Finding his heavy mantle abandoned there was no accident, no careless mistake of the storm. It was a terrifying, deliberate choice. God was passing the torch. That rough fabric held the massive weight of authority, the divine calling, the terrifying power that defined my master's life. Now that immense spiritual burden was being shoved into my hands in the most physical, undeniable way. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of an unearned identity? Picking up that cloak, I wasn't just grabbing old cloth. I was accepting the terrifying burden of his prophetic office. I was taking his place. This mantle would be a stark, visible symbol to me and to everyone watching that I was now the lonely voice of God in Israel. That the very same terrifying spiritual power that consumed Elijah might actually flow through my own veins. This moment finalized the shadow that fell over me years ago, when he first threw that very cloak across my shoulders in a dusty field. What began as a simple invitation to follow was now a terrifying transfer of absolute authority. The long, ancient circle was finally closed. My solitary exile had officially begun. It also meant I had met his impossible final demand, the strict condition for receiving that dangerous double portion of his spirit. Because I didn't look away. Because my own eyes actually witnessed that violent, supernatural departure splitting the sky wide open. I was supposedly ready to inherit this dark, heavy spiritual legacy. The coarse fabric in my hands was the raw instrument of that very promise. The psychological crushing of that moment nearly broke my mind. In mere minutes, I had stared into one of the most terrifying, raw, divine miracles in all of human history. watched my mentor and spiritual father vanish forever, and inherited the back-breaking burden of leading an unfaithful, wandering nation. This fabric felt like a death sentence of privilege and terrifying responsibility. Gripping his ancient cloak in my trembling fists, I immediately faced my first brutal test of faith. I was trapped on the wrong side of the Jordan River, completely cut off from the 50 men watching me from afar. Men who demanded hard proof that I wasn't just a fraud. The deep water that we had split together just hours ago now walled me off from my terrifying new reality. You know that feeling of standing exposed before your harshest critics? This single moment would define if I was accepted or cast out as an imposter. If I could prove that the God of my master was actually listening to me, standing right there beside me, they might finally believe in my fractured identity. But if the heavens stayed silent and I failed to reach God, my life was a lie, and my voice would be utterly meaningless. Shivering right there at the water's muddy edge, I gripped the cloth and struck the river surface, doing exactly what he did. But my first desperate strike failed. Absolute silence. The dark water just mocked me, completely still. That sickening silence nearly shattered whatever fragile courage I had left. The fear of being a fraud rushed in, but I refused to let the darkness win. Instead of collapsing into my own shame, I screamed out over the river, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" It wasn't bitter doubt tearing at my throat. It was a raw, bleeding plea for identity. I begged the very power that ripped the sky open to remember me down here in the dirt. I was demanding heaven to prove it hadn't abandoned me. I was daring God to use my broken hands. I swung the heavy mantle again. This time, the violence was instant. The ancient text records what happened next. The raging water violently tore itself apart left and right, and I walked through on dry ground. The precise, impossible miracle of my father was suddenly happening at my own command. The dreadful truth was undeniable. The Spirit of God had chosen my soul. That terrifying tear in the natural world secured my fractured faith. Mainly, it finally convinced my own trembling heart that the spiritual inheritance wasn't just a cruel illusion. Holding the raw power to rip a river apart, just like he did, proved the terrifying double portion was actually burning inside me. The Creator of the universe was backing my every step. Next, it gave cold, undeniable proof to those 50 cynical men staring from the banks. They saw the old master cut the water. They saw him swallowed by the sky. And now they watched that exact same violent force erupt through my own hands. That visual shock forced them to accept my heavy burden for the dark years coming. Finally, splitting that river set the brutal, exhausting rhythm for my entire life. A rhythm where heaven's fire touches our dirty, grounded reality, proving to lost people that they aren't abandoned. I would soon find out this was just the beginning. My life would become a war against nature, feeding the starving and fighting fear. But remember that my very first strike hit dead water. That failure forced me to learn a dark truth about persistence and wrestling with the divine. Even the chosen ones suffer the agonizing silence of God at first. I realized true faith isn't about being perfectly holy. It is about aggressively crying out to heaven when the shadows start closing in. As I stepped onto the muddy bank, leaving the broken river behind me, I stood face to face with the 50 men who had watched this psychological and spiritual earthquake from the hills of Jericho. They saw the whirlwind, and they saw my trembling hands tear the water. and their sudden, overwhelming reaction is still etched into our ancient historical memory. Those rigid men stared at me and whispered, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on him." Then they collapsed into the dirt, burying their faces at my exhausted feet. Seeing them bow in the dust finally locked my terrible new identity into place. I wasn't just a lonely student anymore. When they said his spirit rested on me, it was bigger than us. Have you ever felt ancient truth settle onto your shoulders? It was a terrifying realization about how deeply human identity is shared, how divine purpose bleeds out from the ghosts of one generation straight into the next. We all knew the exact same wild, lonely fire that consumed my master was now burning up my own life, transforming me forever. I watched him take up the mantle. We pressed our faces into the dirt, terrified and lost. In that dust, I surrendered my pride, recognizing him as the true heir to our master's heavy burden, the new spiritual authority in Israel. My face in the dust wasn't merely ritual. I was trembling before a divine reality. We were accepting his heavy yoke over our fractured brotherhood. From that terrifying second on, I knew my identity was tethered to Elisha. He became our sole guide through this spiritual wilderness. Our shared silence mattered. It meant the darkness of division wouldn't swallow us whole. We wouldn't fight over the scraps of Elijah's legacy. All 50 of us, bound by the same existential dread, surrendered to Elisha as the chosen successor. He needed our unbroken loyalty to face the coming spiritual wars. But inside my heart, I was still blinded by denial. I couldn't accept the cosmic shift I had just witnessed. Desperate, I begged him to let 50 of us hunt through the wilderness for our lost father. I rationalized my panic, hoping God's breath had merely dropped him on some desolate peak or shadow-filled valley. Even after seeing the heavens rip open, my mind clung to the safety of the past. I refused to believe this exile was forever. At first, Elisha rejected my frantic pleas to search. He knew chasing a ghost was useless. Our master belonged to eternity now. Yet my desperate begging wore him down. He finally yielded, realizing I had to exhaust my own fear. I needed to stare into the empty wasteland myself before I could surrender to this frightening new era. 3 agonizing days of wandering yielded nothing, just as he predicted. Stumbling back with empty hands, my failure shattered my final illusion. Elisha's truth took root in my soul. The painful transition of my spiritual identity was now absolute and irreversible. I could never retreat to the comfort of yesterday. The father I relied on was never coming back to save me from the dart. My submission in that dust launched his lonely public journey. Yet my own quiet surrender mirrored the massive crisis of faith our entire nation was about to face. If I, an insider who practically lived in Elijah's shadow, could trust this new guide, maybe the lost souls of our land could find their own faith. Soon after my heart finally yielded, he met the physical decay of my own neighbors. We approached him carrying a burden that was poisoning our homes, our livelihoods, and the very soil beneath our feet. Desperate, I confessed our hidden shame. "Master," I pleaded, "this city looks beautiful on the surface, but the water is cursed, and our ground breathes only death." We were starving in a paradise, watching our flocks wither and our hopes turn to ash. The poisoned spring meant rotting harvests, diseased cattle, and a constant, lingering fear of our own mortality. We lived in the ultimate illusion. Our city sat perfectly near the river, bathed in warm sun, projecting wealth. Yet that toxic undercurrent was slowly drowning our souls and bodies. I didn't turn to politicians or my own pathetic tools. My decision to bring this curse to his feet proved that whispers of his strange authority had penetrated my despair. I saw him not just as a successor, but as a bridge to the divine. Someone who could heal the deep rot no human hands could fix. His answer to my plea felt both terrifyingly simple and heavy with ancient meaning. He demanded I bring a brand new vessel filled with salt. It felt like a riddle. Yet I knew a pristine bowl meant cutting ties with the polluted past, and the salt was a fierce agent of purification. In my forgotten world, salt forged unbroken bonds with the divine, a weapon against our inner decay. Trembling, I handed him the pure offering. He marched straight toward the very spring poisoning our existence. This wasn't a minor stream. It was the heartbeat of our exile. Curing this deep wound would alter the destiny of every isolated soul trapped in our city. Standing at the ruin, he hurled the salt into the black water and declared heaven's verdict. I have purified this flow. Never again will it breed death or barrenness. I watched in awe. The transformation was violent, immediate, and forever. Ancient records swear that spring runs pure even now, anchored by his spoken promise. I felt the earth shift. This wasn't some fading magic trick or a slow recovery. It was a sudden, absolute rebirth, a rescue that would quench the thirst of my descendants. That impossible moment rewired my understanding of faith. It proved the terrifying power he carried wasn't just for cosmic wars. It could actually save me from my daily agony. This wasn't the fiery wrath that slaughtered prophets of old. It was an intimate mercy that healed my broken existence and washed away my despair. I realized his path would be paved with restoration. He was here to bind our wounds, not burn us. My old master called down heavenly fire to consume the wicked and shatter our enemies. But this new guide was focused on mending my fractured soul and feeding the hungry. I finally understood that true grace leaves a permanent mark. This wasn't a fleeting high meant to mask my inner emptiness for a season. It was a structural shift in reality meant to outlive us all. And his choice to weaponize ordinary salt against the poison? That haunted me. It linked a cosmic act directly to my humble dinner table. Every single time I pinch salt over my meals to keep the rot at bay, I remember the day the darkness broke. A simple, mundane spice became my daily altar, a physical memory of impossible rescue. That cured spring launched his terrifying journey among us, laying the absolute bedrock for the legends that would soon consume our fractured nation. Whispers of my healed city raced across the land, awakening dormant hope. We all finally realized a new force walked the earth. He held the exact same raw, staggering power as the father we lost. Yet he wielded it not to strike us down, but to pull us from the grave. I watched Elijah leave and Elisha step forward. For us, this wasn't just a simple leadership shift. It meant we weren't utterly abandoned during our devastating spiritual and political crisis. Our northern kingdom of Israel was still, choking on the ashes of idol worship and moral decay left by Ahab and Jezebel. I desperately needed to know, we all did, that God had not completely forgotten us, that divine power could still reach our deep inner struggles. Elisha stepped up during the dark reign of Jehoram, Ahab's son. We inherited a fractured kingdom, drowning in multiple threats. army surrounded us from the outside, while religious confusion tore our identities apart from the inside. And even our water in Jericho was poisoned, slowly draining our daily lives. This new prophet urgently needed to fix our broken reality and prove that divine power touches every hidden corner of our human existence. The mysterious way Elisha received his calling laid a profound psychological map for our own spiritual journeys. His long, quiet shadow behind Elijah taught me the sheer value of silent preparation and deep surrender. When he dramatically caught that double portion, I realized true spiritual power comes from above, not from our own exhausting human effort. Watching his sudden miraculous power proved to me that when heaven calls you, it also gives you the strength. Seeing Elisha embraced by our prophetic community gave us an anchor. It built a firm foundation that would carry his heavy ministry through the dark years ahead. Those ancient schools of prophets they visited became our sanctuaries. They stood as vital centers for our spiritual training and deep mental renewal. The fragile bonds we forged during Elijah's time would now deeply support and strengthen Elisha's new path. Elijah left in a terrifying storm, while Elisha began in quiet humility. For me, this contrast perfectly mirrored the mysterious dual ways God moves through our world. That fiery chariot tearing Elijah into the sky revealed raw, undeniable divine glory and power. But Elisha healing our bitter, toxic water? That showed me deep compassion for our everyday survival. I needed both to truly grasp the complex nature of heavenly love and might. Seeing Elisha stand as our new guide fulfilled a whisper, an ancient promise made to Elijah on the desolate rocks of Mount Horeb years ago. Back when Elijah felt utterly crushed and alone, the divine voice promised a successor, someone to carry the crushing weight of this prophetic calling forward. Standing there, I saw that ancient promise breathe. The painful work of dragging our lost identities back to faith would continue under him. That heavy double portion of spirit Elisha begged for? It became the exact armor we needed to survive the terrifying trials crashing toward us. This historical record proves he performed twice the miracles Elijah did. I witnessed it firsthand, confirming his desperate cry for massive spiritual power had been answered. This intense spiritual map gave him the strength to guide us. Our spiritual hunger was agonizingly deep, and the sinister forces opposing our true faith were dangerously strong. Surviving that shift from Elijah to Elisha became our blueprint. It created a psychological framework of succession that we desperately needed for our future. It taught me that divine purpose outlives our brief lives. It passes down, proving that deep preparation and mental training are absolutely essential for true transformation. It showed us that heavenly power remains fiercely available to anyone, in any era, willing to seek it and surrender to its terrifying, beautiful purpose. You and I are walking this exact same desert today. If finding this ancient spiritual map strengthens your faith, subscribe to our channel. Join me for more profound biblical mysteries. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new insights that will guide your own spiritual survival. And please, share this message of endurance with your family and friends. Because out there, the world is starving for proof of divine faithfulness. These deep psychological echoes of ancient history can anchor our modern anxieties and heal our weary, fractured souls. Passing this on might be the exact lifeline someone desperately needs today. Thank you for walking through this ancient, dusty, profound text with me.
Until next time, I pray you walk with the same fierce faith and raw identity that defined those two great men of valor.
God.